Over the next few days, we intend to expose each of you to different nuances of the legislative process. Bruce went through the agenda today. I'm very pleased with the schedule we've got over those 4 days and hope it will help you understand different aspects of the process. I'm certainly pleased we will have several lawmakers join us as panelists throughout this to talk about different ways the lawmakers are looking at the session and what they feel will come about from this year. It's been mixed signals about what we can expect from the session this year. And I know we'll go more into that as the process develops, but each session of the legislature is unique. I've been working out there in and around that building since 1994. And I can't think of a session that mirrored another one. They're that drastic when it comes to the changes in individuals who serve and the policies that are brought up. And I feel this one's going to be no different. This one's probably going to be very unique. And we want each of you to be able to be effective in reaching out to your own lawmakers you may work with, and the organizations you represent, or the issues that you're going to champion. So I want to get started with my presentation. I hope everyone can see that. Somebody unmute and say, yes, you can see it.
You can't see it.
All right. Then this is why they don't trust me with technology. So screen share. How about that?
It's pulled up now.
All right. So for our Legislative Learning Lab, we put this together several years ago, and we've shown it each time, but it doesn't get old. I know most of you think of government from the old Schoolhouse Rock cartoon, which coincidentally tonight on ABC is the 50th anniversary of Schoolhouse Rock. So if you're not busy tonight, be sure and tune into that. But there's so much more that goes into this. For every 2 years, we choose half of our state Senate, and then the entire state House of Representatives, all 101 members, they serve on 2-year terms. So if someone files against a member, then they will have a challenger for their seat. Likewise, the same for our 5 U.S. House members who represent us in Washington, D.C. Now, every 4 years in non-presidential years, which was the term that we just finished in 2022, we have our statewide elected officials that are up for a challenge. And then we also have staggered terms for our corporation commissioners. And then we have the staggered terms also for our 2 U.S. senators. The elections, you see a state government trifecta is a term to describe single party government when one political party holds the position of governor and majorities in both the state and legislative chambers. And according to Ballotpedia, there are 22 Republican trifectas, 17 Democratic trifectas, and 11 divided governments where neither party holds a trifecta control. Oklahoma, of course, is one of those 22 Republican trifectas. So, breakdown for our House of Representatives. We have, as I said, 101 House members. The districts happen with redistricting in the census. After the census, the federal government will turn over the numbers to the state, and then the legislature will form committees to divide up the districts by equal population, which was a Supreme Court ruling. And we have to have equal representation in those districts as close as it can possibly get. The House members serve on a 2-year term. Republicans have controlled the House since 2004. Current breakdown is 81 Republicans and 20 Democrats in the House. And the presiding officer who is elected by the body is Speaker Charles McCall from Atoka. For the Senate, they have 48 members on 4-year staggered terms. For a 2-year period, they will elect the even numbered districts, and then 2 years later, they will elect the odd numbered districts. Then the Republicans have controlled their chamber since 2008. 2006, it actually was a tie with Glenn Coffey and Mike Morgan serving as co-president pro tems of the Senate, and it actually functioned very well with a divided Senate. And we were very pleased with the outcome of how well they were able to work together. The current breakdown is 40 Republicans, 8 Democrats. The president pro tem of the Senate, the presiding officer is Greg Treat from Oklahoma City. And then the lieutenant governor is the president of the Senate, just like what we see at the federal government, with the vice president being the president of the Senate. And those are really ceremonial duties where they will come in and break ties, but they don't have the power to appoint committees or run the day-to-day operations. With legislation, this is important for individuals to understand. There are different types of legislation that can be filed by lawmakers. Over in the Senate, you're going to have Senate bills, Senate joint resolutions, Senate concurrent resolutions, and Senate resolutions. In the House, you'll have House bills, House joint resolutions, House concurrent resolutions, and House simple resolutions. And you'll see the numbering there. The Senate starts their bill numbering with 1. The House starts theirs with 1001. The reason being, years ago, they never imagined the day when the Senate would file 1,000 bills in a 2-year period. And now we're getting up to that in the first year alone. In the Senate, there is no limit to how many bills you can file each session if you're a senator. In the House, you're limited to 8 bills that can be heard. House members can file much more if they want, but your first 8 you file are the only ones that are considered live rounds, is what they're nicknamed, and the only ones that can advance through the process. If you decide one of those later bills is something that you would rather file within the first week or 2, then you can get permission from the presiding officer to swap those, but that doesn't happen very often. They demand the representatives do this in advance to keep the staff from being overwhelmed with requests like that. So with the bills, you have the force and effect of law. They must be passed by both chambers. They must be signed by the governor, except when the measure refers a question to a vote of the people. And it generally, almost always, proposes changes to the Oklahoma statutes, the set of laws that have been passed through the years that we must follow as state citizens, or even as individuals who visit the state. So with joint resolutions, they're similar to bills, as in they also have the force and effect of law. They must be passed by both chambers, signed by the governor, unless it refers to a question to the public, which most of the state questions that are proposed by lawmakers are filed as joint resolutions. And then they often will not become a part of the statutes, like that example I just gave that refers something to a vote of the people or has something that would be a temporary change. Concurrent resolutions and the simple resolutions are very similar, and they don't have the force and effect of law. They must be passed, the concurrent resolutions by both chambers, the simple resolutions by one chamber. They're not signed by the governor, don't become a part of the statutes, and they're both used to express the opinions of the body or encourage some action. So you oftentimes will hear about the lawmakers honoring an individual or an organization. Those are usually done by simple resolutions. Now, measures that would be considered through the legislative session will go through different stages in a timeline. The very first step for a piece of legislation would be the introduced version. That's when the lawmaker comes up with an idea and they turn it over to the legislative staff. In the House, will be the legislative legal staff, and the Senate, you'll have your committee staff that will work on bills, and they will draw those ideas up. Once that idea has been completed and approved by the lawmaker, they will do the bill filing. The deadline for bill filing was January 19th of this year. And so everything has been filed and is ready to go for the session. That's considered the introduced version of the bill, the very first step in the process. When the legislature commences and the committees begin, then they will be heard by committees. The committee chairs will decide which bills they want to discuss. And then over a 2, 3, 4 week period, the committees will meet and discuss the different bills the committee chair decides are worthy. And once they have a hearing committee, they pass out of the committee, that's considered the committee version. About half of the bills easily are killed in this first step with the committees, with not getting a hearing. Some are combined together if they're similar in nature. Some just the committee chair decides they don't want to hear and it's dead for the year. Could possibly be heard the following year, but it's very tough to get a bill heard in the second session if it wasn't heard in the first. So after it passes out of the committee, Then it goes to the full floor, where either in the House with 101 members or the Senate with 48 members, during a floor session, we'll hear the description of the bill with the author's explanation. Members will be able to ask questions, which is a little bit different than Robert's Rules of Order standard procedure. The questions will be about the subject of what the bill is doing, and it has to stick to the topic of the legislation. Once the questions are completed, then you can possibly have amendments filed on the bill. Once the amendments are done, then the bill is considered third read. All bills have to go through 3 readings. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. But when it's considered third read, then it's open up for debate. Once the debate happens on it, then a vote. And it must pass by a majority of those elected to and constituting either the House or the Senate. So a bill must get 51 votes to pass in the House, or it must get 25 votes to pass in the Senate. Once a bill makes it off the floor and passes, it's considered engrossed. Now, the engrossed version will go to the opposite body and go through the exact same timeline, which we'll discuss later, where the bills will go through a committee hearing, floor action, possible amendments, and then be passed. If the House and the Senate disagree on language, then the bill will be sent to a conference committee made up of members of the House and the Senate that will work out the differences and hopefully come up with a compromise version of the bill. That conference committee version will have been brought to the floor for both bodies, and if passed, it would go to the governor. Once a bill passes out of the legislative branch, it's considered enrolled. It rolls out of the legislative branch to the executive branch, is the memory trick that I try and teach people. So the enrolled version will go to the governor, and the governor will have time to decide what the governor is going to do with the bill. And if it passes, it becomes law. And if the governor vetoes it, then we'll go through that process. But the next thing we need to look at is, what will a bill do? A bill can create new law. It can come up with a completely new idea that's not been discussed before or ever put into state statute. Most bills will amend language. The amendatory version of the bill will go through and change something that's currently in Oklahoma statute, and it will modify it some form or fashion. So you're going to see up to 1 page to 500 pages in a piece of legislation with different sections. And like I said, amendatory language is usually what you're going to see. But every now and then at the end of a bill, you'll see one section that says repealer, and section such and such of the Oklahoma statutes is hereby repealed. They don't write out the language of what is being repealed. So as you're reading through the bills, it's important, almost imperative, that you go and read that section through OSCN or another site that tracks the state statutes to see what is being repealed out of the current law. Most bills, as said down there, amend it. So you have to look through and just check on what each of these will do and cross-reference with what's happened in the past. Now for the timeline, here's what we're generally looking at in a fiscal year, because that's what the state operates under. So first day of July is when the budget that's passed by the legislature goes into effect. And they will go through budget hearings really starting in August and commence through October, November, meeting with the state agencies to discuss what happens. Greg Sawyer is going to talk a lot more about the budget process and a later panel discussion, conversation with the Learning Lab. So be sure and tune into that if you want to understand more about how the fiscal process works with the state. Now, we're going to look at bills, the beginning of those really taking shape through interim studies over the summer. Lawmakers will visit and discuss about the different things, and some of those will have a fiscal impact. And so they always try and bring in the fiscal staff to discuss what's going to happen with the impact of that bill. Now, as we get through that and going back up here to the top of January, and the years following an election cycle, they will have an organizational day where they will come together and talk about the different rules that need to change as far as the legislature, what they follow internally, and then looking at electing their leadership for the upcoming 2 years. And then February is when session begins. February, March, April, May. The process will be the discussion of the bills that are filed and shaping that new budget and getting it prepared. The legislature must adjourn by the final Friday in May. Constitutionally, they can only meet the first Monday in February through the final Friday in May, unless they call themselves back into a special session, or if the governor calls them into a special session. So they have to traditionally have all their business done by that last week in May. And then June is just really a wrap-up period to decompress, figure out exactly what they did. The staff will put together summaries of what happened, and then get prepared for that fiscal year to start off. Our governor, J. Kevin Stitt, was reelected last year. The governor serves on a 4-year term with a term limit of 2 terms, so a total of 8 years, unless they come in as lieutenant governor to assume the office. If it's within the final 2 years of the term for the lieutenant governor, assuming the powers of the governor, the lieutenant governor becoming the governor could actually serve for up to 10 years. We've seen Governor Nye become governor twice as lieutenant governor. And so that can happen. It hasn't happened in modern history. So we'll just wait and see what happens for the next one that will leave office early for some reason, and the lieutenant governor step into that. So with the powers and duties of the governor, they're a head of state and the chief executive of the state of Oklahoma, the commander-in-chief of the Oklahoma National Guard, and they appoint with confirmation cabinet secretaries and various agency directors. And we have seen legislation filed this year that could possibly restore some of the agency commissions to hiring executive directors. So that's something we're going to certainly watch as it goes through the process. In the past, the powers of the governor were weakened with commissions being able to hire executive directors. The legislature over the last 6-8 years has changed things where the governor can appoint more of those state agency leaders, but it's given the governor more power in recent years. But we'll watch what happens with these upcoming bills. The governor will deliver a state of the state address to the legislature on the first day of session. If you're with us on Monday, that will be one of the things that will culminate the Learning Lab, where we will listen to Governor Stitt's state of the state and then have a panel discussion following, looking at what the governor said and did not say with the state of the state, and in anticipation of what we can expect for 2023 in the legislative session. So I've said before, the governor has the ability to sign and veto bills. You will see here, the governor actually has 4 different steps that he can take in the process with legislation. It's unique to with Oklahoma having 4 different ways to handle legislation. So the governor can approve a measure by signing it within 5 days of receipt to his office, and these are business days. And the governor can veto the measure by returning it within 5 days, Sundays accepted, with objections. The legislature might be in session, therefore providing the opportunity to override. I will tell you, the lawmakers will pass most of their major agenda items the week before the final week of session, because they want to stick to that 5-day deadline to have the opportunity to override a veto if that would be a possibility. The governor can also pocket passage a measure if it's passed prior to the last 5 days of session. So if a bill passes, it can go to the desk of the governor, and say it's in March, April, a bill goes to the desk of the governor. The governor might not like it, but recognizes it's something that needs to become law. So the governor can leave that bill on his desk for 5 days and it would automatically become law with pocket passage. Now, the exception is, as I said before, when we get to the final 5 days, then when a bill goes to the desk of the governor, it can sit for 5 days, and the governor can take up to 15 days, Sundays accepted, to decide what he wants to do with the bill. And it will sit there, and you're going to see usually a flood of bills right there at the very end, either signed or vetoed by the governor, as the governor takes more time. Now, part of this, the logic with this is a lot of bills pass right there at the end. And so the governor needs more time to look at these ideas and study the ramifications. But the governor, if he decides he doesn't like the bill, he can just leave it on the desk, and he doesn't want to put his signature on the veto. Maybe it's something he personally agrees with, but recognizes it's not good for the state, then he can allow it to sit on his desk and become pocket vetoed. So Those will happen occasionally, not very often, but it is a step in the process that can happen. Just want to make sure that y'all understand that. Now, the legislature, before those final 5 days and during those final 5 days, they can override the veto of the governor. If a bill passes by a majority, and if it has an emergency clause on the end, which takes a 2/3 vote, then it would go back to the legislature if the governor vetoes it, and it would be a 2/3 vote to override the bill and a 3/4 vote to override the emergency clause. If you're not sure what an emergency clause is, that does away with the 90-day restriction for bills to sit to allow the public to put petitions together and try and get a measure that's passed by the legislature and signed by the governor to go to a vote of the people. This was attempted with House Bill 1017, where they didn't have enough time to get the signatures within those 90 days, but then they started up another petition after the fact to do away with House Bill 1017, the education reforms that passed in the 1990s. And if you remember, that did go to a vote of the people, but the people upheld House Bill 1017 and kept those education reforms in law. Now, they've been done away with in some parts through the years by future legislatures. So any of those things that pass are not binding permanently unless they're in the Constitution, and it's a tough process to try and get something taken out of the Constitution. So there are a lot of steps there. You have to be aware of the numbers needed to get a bill passed or to get a veto overridden if it is decided by the governor he doesn't want something to go into effect. So you have to be nimble and quick with this because you're operating on a short time frame. Now, with the judicial branch, Jerry Askins is going to talk more about this tomorrow, but I wanted to have this in here just to show you the system that's set up as far as how the judicial branch is established. Oklahoma's court system, we're different than other states, except Texas, of course, in that Oklahoma has two courts of last resort, the Supreme Court and the Court of Criminal Appeals. The one we traditionally deal with the most would be the Supreme Court when it comes to judicial review and legislation. All the bills that pass the legislature signed by the governor can be brought up by the court for judicial review to determine if they uphold the state constitution. Now, if it's a constitutional amendment, that's pretty clear because the court has to follow the state constitution. If it violates federal law, then it can be challenged up. But our Supreme Court will go through and look at laws and determine to make sure that they are constitutional and that the will of the people, the rights of the people are protected. We have 9 justices on the Oklahoma Supreme Court and 5 judges on the Court of Criminal Appeals. Now you see the difference there. Justices serve on Supreme Courts, whether it's state or federal. Those are the only people in the judicial branch who are called justices, the members of Supreme Courts. Everyone else is a judge. Supreme Court immediate jurisdiction with respect to new first impression issues, important legal issues, and cases of great public interest. So that is my presentation. I want to open it up a little bit for a conversation with all of you as we're getting started early in the week. Want to hear from you about some of the concerns you might have about the process, any questions you might have. I've left about 10 to 15 minutes on here for y'all to be able to have a conversation. If you want to type your questions in the chat section, I'll certainly try and answer those, and we'll certainly record these for any of the upcoming panels that might address those issues. So love for you to jump in now. If you speak one at a time, we know how Zoom etiquette is these days. It's tough. So feel free to type in or unmute and ask us any questions you might have. I know y'all are not a bashful group. All of you are advocates in some form or fashion. I've had 2 cups of coffee already, so I'm wired. I hope y'all have.
I joke. I think some of us are state employees, so it's a little scary to even ask a question from my perspective sometimes on here.
That's a good point. And I want to make sure you have my email address. It's jdorman, JDORMAN at oica.org. And we'll put it in the chat section. If you ever have any questions that you want kept quiet, confidential, I certainly will respect that. Also, if you have issues that deal with child concerns, we're here. The Oklahoma Commission on Children and Youth is the state agency that oversees the investigations on many issues with children. I know they handle that, but we also work very well with them, and we're very thankful that they're in the same building with us. Anytime y'all have concerns, don't hesitate to reach out to me. I felt that way as a lawmaker also, and I'm certain most of your own individual lawmakers will also share that. If you have a concern that you see, reach out to them. And if you want to put it in business terms, people like to refer to government as being like a business. It's not true. Businesses operate to make a profit. Governments operate to provide services, and they should operate on a stable budget and provide the services on whatever the executive as the CEO and the legislature as the board of directors determines is what is reasonable by the budgets they pass. But they also need to be aware of concerns and issues that are out there, and they want people to reach out to them. I joke around, I had an open door policy, playing off my last name, that we would take concerns in and look at that and try and keep people aware of what was going on. So we've got Adrian asks, do we have any recommendations for House Bill 2513 Handle with Care? I know that's going to be one of the topics we'll talk about with coalitions later today. There is a coalition formed around about that piece of legislation. The important thing is to have like-minded groups that can provide input, numbers to contact lawmakers, and provide accurate information to those lawmakers as it's going through the process. You have to be very careful to make sure lawmakers receive correct information. Don't ever exaggerate an issue, or if you're not aware of something, tell the lawmaker you don't know the answer, but you'll get back to them and then get back to them. But it's important never to give a lawmaker inaccurate information, because if they say it on the floor and they're caught, it embarrasses them and they'll never trust you again. So always make sure that information you present to lawmakers can be repeated, because they will oftentimes need to repeat it. Handle with Care is an issue that's been brought up over the last several sessions about trying to expand this issue statewide on how we handle children who have been involved with an issue possibly the night before, where police have been called. Law enforcement can contact the schools and let the school administration, the teachers know, simply with the tagline, the children need to be handled with care. They won't go into the specifics of the case because they can't, but teachers need to know that if the child is acting differently than they normally do, that's the issue, and they probably are going to be very stressed and have a lot of emotion that day. So don't punish them for something that's happened the night before. So we're certainly working as a coalition to try and get that piece of legislation brought forth. Thank the lawmakers that are working on that. Thank Adrian and her team for working on that issue. And yes, what we're going to do with the recordings is we've hired Randy Casimus, who's a professional editor. We're going to break each section of the Learning Lab into an individual video where you'll be able to download these and watch them again. Or if you're an educator, you'll be able to play those for your classes so they can hopefully watch this and learn something from the conversations that happen here. A lot of the things we're going to talk about aren't in any textbooks, but they're vital information that is needed to better understand government. So those recordings, hopefully within a week or two, will be up on our website. And as a nonprofit, was the fine line between advocacy and lobbying. So I know Ashley will talk a little bit about more of that with ethics laws, but I will tell you the IRS, if you're a registered nonprofit, you're allowed to spend up to about 20% of your budget for activities to promote different ideas. You have a very fine line between advocacy, lobbying, and activism, all three aspects. So with the lobbying, you want to be very careful. State agencies cannot lobby. Sometimes they will have a legislative liaison that will go answer questions, but they're not supposed to promote bills using state dollars. So they have a very difficult task where they can just simply answer questions and provide information about how harmful a bill might be or how positive the impact might be for their agency. Lobbyists are hired by organizations. In fact, OICA has a lobbying team that represents us at the Capitol, and we make it very, very hard line that we never spend more than 20% of our budget. We can go up to that 20% under IRS law. But when we're out there, they track bills, and we have to differentiate between advocacy and the lobbying aspect. We get very involved in the passage of legislation because that's the mission of OICA. It's why we were created 40 years ago. And so it's our job to make certain that bills pass that are good or fail if they're not good for Oklahoma's children. And so just be very careful and monitor your dollars very closely to make sure you never cross that line. And then Ashley will talk more about the ethics laws and rules that are in effect of what you can and cannot do at the Capitol. So I'm definitely not going to step on her toes because she is a fantastic resource expert when it comes to those issues of what you can and can't do at the Capitol. I'm not sure if this is time or place, but I understand how, well, we're not going to talk about Secretary Walters or Superintendent Walters. I know that's going to be a conversation that will be discussed probably by lawmakers or be determined by the process on holding those two positions. You mentioned that about half of the bills get killed in the committee version. What are some of the reasons a bill gets killed? Really, it's the whim of the chair. If the chair of the committee does not like a bill, then it can be set aside. Sometimes a chair might hear a bill that they don't like, but they recognize it's a good bill, and then they'll vote against it. That doesn't happen very often. And there's no guideline as far as what a bill why a bill should be considered or not. Now, if it's unconstitutional, I would hope committee chairs would kill the bill. But sometimes they consider it a work in progress and will allow something to pass out. If it's an issue they like, but they may not like the language, hoping it will get worked through. And that's the entire reason the legislature goes through all these different steps and goes through a 4-month process is hopefully to come up with the best version of the bill before it passes. Sometimes you will see a bill get shucked, and that's when the entire language of the bill gets removed and something of a different topic, maybe fairly similar, but truly it is a different topic, will be brought forth. In years past, that was against the rules. But over the last few years, we've seen more and more shucked bills make the way through the process. And that, I don't like that as far as someone who likes to follow the rules with the process. And I think that is concerning that language can be brought up really at the last minute with very few days to review and get passed. It doesn't give the public enough time to weigh in with input to lawmakers about what is good and what is bad about a piece of legislation. We speak to the issue, the process of agencies presenting budgets to the Appropriations Committee, referring to state school superintendent. I know everyone saw those videos last week. The process is an agency director or a designee, possibly the physical agent of the agency, will go before a committee of the legislature and present the budget for the upcoming year. As the lawmakers are working their way through the process, the members of the Appropriations Committee are charged with drawing up a budget. You have 2 chairs, one in the House, one in the Senate, 2 vice chairs, and then members of the committees. And then you'll have subcommittees on different topics. Like Mark Lawson has been fantastic to work with in the Health and Human Services area with the budget. Though they will go through those different specific areas, meet with those agency directors, and determine, based upon the recommendations of the agency director, what should be in the budget, what shouldn't be. Now, as the process develops through those 4 months, lawmakers will file bills that might create a new task. And that will have to be included in the budget ultimately, unless there's language in the bill that says, if funds are available. That can be a curse in a bill. A great idea can pass by the legislature, and if it says, if funds are available, and that becomes law, and then the Appropriations Committee doesn't put the funds in place to actually implement that program, that's where we see problems. And so always look for that language in legislation, because that means it's no guarantee that a wonderful program will happen just because the funds were never put in place. And so if that's something you're working on through an organization, always watch for that language in the bill. So as the lawmakers and the committees will hear these through the different subcommittees, they will shape the plan along with the legislative staff. The staff for each of the divisions and different areas of the Capitol have quite a bit of expertise and years of service generally. And so they can remember what happened 5, 10, 20 years ago. And so working with the staff, those lawmakers will develop those budgets. The agency directors need to come in and present a realistic plan and give those lawmakers, essentially the board of directors, the ability to know what's happening as they develop that budget. Now, the governor will present a budget to the legislature in the first week of session, and that is a guide for the lawmakers to use based upon what the governor feels each of the agencies should have in their budgets. The legislature does not have to follow that. The governor can veto the budget if the governor doesn't like what the legislature has done, and then it can be put forward as a veto override if the governor does veto that. We've seen that happen in the past. That happened with Governor Henry and Speaker Hyatt back about 20 years ago. So things can change, or about that time. So things can change all throughout the process depending upon what is brought forth by the legislature and the conversation with the governor at the end of session. Tara recently attended an OK Center for Nonprofits training. They recommended filing 501H. Maybe Ashley can discuss. I would definitely bring that up with Ashley. There are different systems within the tax filings of what is best. 501c3 status, the different statuses that are implemented by the federal government. You need to make sure that you have the right status for your organization and what you follow. These have all been some fantastic questions. I have a couple of private ones in here thanking us for this. So thank you all for being a part of this. We always greatly appreciate the opportunity to present this 4-day conversation. We hope those of you that will be joining us in person on Monday enjoy that. Monday is going to be a busy day with the lawmakers present, with the conversations with Chief Hoskin, with Dr. Gaddy presents a wonderful synopsis of Oklahoma history of how we got to where we're at politically. And we certainly hope you will stay through all 4 days. First 3 are virtual. I did have one person call me asking why the building was not open this morning. Apologize for those of you who thought today was the in-person day. Hopefully not many of you went over there, but we would love to have you all join us in person Monday if you can, or join us on here. We're going to do everything we can to make sure the technology is up to speed where you have a wonderful experience all 4 days, whether you're with us in person or not. Are there more questions? Y'all have had some fantastic questions. I do want to talk a little bit about advocacy until we have to wrap this up. Christine, how much more time do I have? Or someone from our team? I think I've got about 5 more minutes.
I think you have about 15 minutes.
Oh, well, I can answer plenty of questions if you have more questions, but I do want to talk a little bit about some of the tips for advocacy and what you can and can't do at the Capitol. I have a different slideshow, and we have these slideshows on our website, and you'll be able to go and pull down the different presentations as well as the videos on our website soon. We'll try and get those up as quickly as we can. There are different tips as far as advocacy that I want you to follow as far as getting to know your lawmakers and effectively communicating with your lawmakers. Those of you that are state employees, that was brought up, you have to be very careful. You cannot do any lobbying or truly outreach on the clock. If it's a part of your job and it's something a lawmaker needs to know, certainly run it up to your supervisor to make sure that you won't get in trouble by contacting a lawmaker, because I know there are some people that worry about those points of contact if it's not the company line. So just be careful you won't get yourself in trouble. If you contact a lawmaker after hours, use your own personal phone or your personal email address. Don't use state equipment or state resources to contact a lawmaker. When you reach out to a lawmaker, make certain that you have all the information that you need. Introduce yourself. It's always great for lawmakers to meet people in person, and they want to have those resource experts that they can call upon if a bill comes up. So try and make yourself available for that, whether you're a state agency employee or private citizen working for a nonprofit. Those of you who work for nonprofits, especially you agency directors, if your own lawmakers are not your best friends, you need to make that so. You also need to find out who are the committee chairs over the areas where you would work. Children, Youth, and Family Services. I plan on bothering John Talley a lot this session. And John's a great guy. I love working with him. So I was very thankful that he was replacing Carol Bush in that area. And so I know we're going to have a great working relationship going forward. But as these ideas come up, respect the lawmaker's time. Don't call them at 1 a.m. And yes, as a lawmaker, I have received calls at 5 a.m. from farmers who think it's completely normal to call somebody at 5 a.m., but don't do that. Generally, they're sleeping in till at least 6 o'clock. So stick within the right times, reach out to their office, and make a new friend with their legislative assistant or executive assistant. And I know we'll talk a little bit about more of that later on in the Learning Lab. But those gatekeepers at the Capitol are the ones that determine if your note is at the top of the list or the bottom of the list. So introduce yourself to the legislative or executive assistant, legislative assistants in the House, executive assistants in the Senate, and get to know them. Set up a time when you might be able to go by the Capitol and visit with them, or if they're in session, the lawmakers are there Monday through Thursday, they will be home on Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. And sometimes the lawmaker might want to meet at the local coffee shop and visit about this topic. So if you're in their legislative district, that's always the easiest path to follow. Send an email introducing yourself, say you want to get to know them better, provide information, be of help when they need it, and then have that conversation, talk to them about that issue. I would advise you to do it outside the campaign cycle, because during campaign season, they're going to be looking for donations. And so you run the risk of having to write a donation to them if they're struggling in their election. And you may choose you want to do that, and you have to decide if that's something you feel comfortable doing. But donations are needed for those lawmakers that are doing a good job to make sure that they come back to the Capitol. We've lost a lot of good lawmakers in the past just because they couldn't afford to run a good campaign. So you just have to be aware of what you're comfortable with, what is allowed by your organization. Never make a donation as a nonprofit organization to a lawmaker, and never endorse them as your organization. And I'd strongly suggest, if you're an executive, Marnie Taylor will agree with me with this, don't get yourself in trouble, because you certainly don't want the donation to be listed as coming from the organization. So make it very clear to them if you write a check that's coming from you personally and not the organization, because that is something that will get you in trouble with the IRS, as well as possibly be a news story. So just be very careful. But don't let that hamper you with making that connection, because they truly do need those individuals that can be resource experts and provide vital information when it comes to votes. And I know we're going to need a lot of that this session, educating lawmakers. We've got a large freshman class coming in, the new lawmakers, they're called freshmen. So it just seems you can never get away from that term sometimes. You have to make sure that you introduce yourself to them, get to know them, and they're drinking from a fire hose right now. Another reason why we created this program, to hopefully help them better understand the process. So make that connection, understand they may not get back to you immediately. If you don't hear from them within a few days, reach back out and just say, I wanted to make sure my note didn't get overlooked, but would love to visit with you and talk about some of the issues coming up. But just recognize there are probably dozens, if not hundreds of people also trying to do the same thing with them. But it's important to make that connection, especially when it comes to the need there as the bills are going through the session. It's also important to find out who will look over the ideas for the governor. Generally, you can reach out to the governor's office and leave a note on voicemail. 521-2342, I think, is the governor's number that people will call in to leave a message. You can also email the governor, and they will keep contact or keep count of all of the different notes that come in for and against legislation. Now, we don't know what the numbers are, but they keep track of that. And hopefully, if there is a large number of people contacting the governor about something, that will weigh into consideration. Same with lawmakers. Now, it's also important to point out when you contact a lawmaker, if you live in their legislative district, point out that you're a constituent. And if you're not a registered voter, you need to be a registered voter unless you can't. So be sure you're a registered voter. When I was a lawmaker, I would get emails from constituents in Virginia or Louisiana wanting me to vote a certain way. Well, they're not my constituents because they don't live in my legislative district. Even if they were in Eastern Oklahoma, they weren't my constituents when I represented House District 65. So always put your address so they can verify that you truly are a constituent. And I will tell you, that goes a long ways to impacting that specific lawmaker because they want your vote every 2 years or every 4 years. And so if you are a constituent and you're respectful to them and polite, you have to agree to disagree on some things because you don't want to burn a bridge because they may be against you this time, but you might be able to sway them on the next issue. So keep your cool with those lawmakers and talk to them. The written information that you provide, make sure it's concise. It's one page, maybe a page front and back. Lots of pictures, graphs, charts, make it visually appealing and provide the facts, and always have the ask in there. Ask them what you want, whether it's to vote for or against a bill or support funding for a project or come visit your organization. Whatever you do, make sure you have that ask in there, because if they just get something that's informational, they'll look at it, but it'll get filed somewhere. If there's an ask, especially with a time, make sure you follow up with their assistant to get that on their calendar. Lawmakers love to be invited to public events in their districts, or if it's a county seat, oftentimes they will come to the county seat, even if that seat, say Lawton. For me, Lawton wasn't in my district. One precinct was in Lawton, but I went to a ton of events in Lawton just because it was part of my district as far as the county seat. So make sure you invite them to those things. When you schedule events, make sure they're scheduling around the legislative session if you want them to be there. Get things to them early. And I'm talking 3-4 months in advance because their schedules fill up quickly. But if you're doing something that is important, invite the lawmakers, invite the press, and turn it into the spectacle that you deserve. Get that coverage to make sure that you get those ideas out there. Any other questions? Jeff Talent, you've always got questions. Nope.
Not yet.
Not yet. OICA team, was there anything I didn't cover you can think of? Peyton Stacy is our policy director and is going through looking at the different bills with our legislative team right now. For those of you that aren't familiar with OICA, we are a statewide organization, works on policy. We do 2 conferences each year. We do the Learning Lab right before session to educate about the process, but then we also have a fall forum held in November each year, sometimes October, generally in November, to go through different ideas and issues that should be brought forth to lawmakers. And so we will shape different ideas with advocates and put together a legislative agenda and present that to lawmakers before the bill filing deadline, the first bill filing deadline, and hopefully get those ideas put in place. Handle with care is one of those issues that's been brought forth at a fall forum before. And so we want to make sure that we get those issues into the legislative agenda. Another one we're looking at this year is high quality legal representation to improve the court system for families and make sure kids have a fair day in whatever court they're in. And so those different ideas are discussed at fall forum. They're brought forth in our legislative agenda. And we find those authors to submit those ideas and get them moving through the process. So it really is a year-round process with legislative issues to make sure that you're raising awareness. Another good tool to use is interim studies. following the legislative session, February, March, April, May, they finish up. Generally in June, the presiding officers will announce a deadline for when interim studies can be filed. Those studies are submitted by individual lawmakers or groups of lawmakers to look at a different topic. And they will submit that as an idea for review. It will be sent to the committee where it would best fit for a hearing. The committee chair would decide if they want to discuss this topic with an interim study. And if it goes through all the steps, then the committees will meet in the summer or fall months and go through this topic. It's presented by the requesting lawmaker or an organization that works with the lawmaker to bring forth the conversation about why that's important. One that we recently did was with Senator Kay Floyd and Senator Julia Kurt looking at suicide prevention for youth in Oklahoma. We brought a team together, including Mental Health and Substance Abuse Services, Oklahoma Commission on Children and Youth, Department of Health, to look, and private individuals, to look at different aspects of how and why youth commit suicide or attempt to commit suicide. It was a wonderful conversation delving into a very important issue that hopefully has led to some changes. You want that to be the part of the interim study to bring about a suggestion of how we can improve policy on an important topic. And that's one of those very important topics, finding ways to reduce down or eliminate the number of suicides we see. It's a far different world what we're in right now, even than just a few years ago, with the trauma and the mental health concerns faced by youth with not being around each other during the pandemic. And so anything we can do to try and improve policies to make things better for kids and Oklahomans as a whole, we want to see that happen with interim studies. Here we have a question over here. A lot of duplicate bills are filed by different lawmakers every year. Any reason why so many similar identical bills are filed each session? The answer is yes. Those are kept confidential unless a lawmaker publicly announces to their colleagues they're filing a bill on a topic, maybe with a press release or a conversation. They don't know, and the staff is to keep all bill requests confidential. And so you're going to see several bills filed with different topics. I know Chris Benj and I filed bills dealing with electric vehicles one year. He was the Speaker of the House. I was a member of the minority. So you probably don't have to guess too hard whose bill was heard. We did work together on that topic, and our bills were very similar because the staff will type those up. And if the request is similar, the bill is going to be similar. And then you will also see some organizations that will present model language from a national perspective. And it's up to the staff to go through and make that fit in Oklahoma statutes. You have to hope the lawmakers are willing to let them adapt that. Sometimes they don't, and it causes more problems than creates good when the staff doesn't have the ability to rewrite it to conform with statutes. So you have to watch out for both of those things, multiple bills, and work with all the lawmakers. Generally, the person who's in the majority with the most seniority will probably be the person that runs that with the help of the other lawmakers. They'll all be listed as, first one is the author, the rest of them are co-authors, and they will work together to try and get those passed. Every bill also has an author in each body. The House members will shepherd the bill through the House, and Senate members will shepherd it through the Senate. It doesn't matter if it's House bill or Senate bill, the person who's listed as the primary author from each body, it's their responsibility to get things through. One of the tips is bills are weakest when they're in the opposite body from what they were originally filed. The original author usually has a much more vested interest, which is why they filed the bill. And when it gets over, it may have less support. So if you're trying to kill the bill, keep that in mind as a tip or a trick of the trade. But if you have a House member and a Senate member who both filed the bill in each chamber, that means they probably have equal interest in it, and so that makes it much more difficult. And you have some lawmakers who are very staunch supporters of certain policies. Chris Steele, as Speaker, championed a lot of criminal justice reform. I had the pleasure of working with him on a lot of that stuff, and it's led to him where he's in his career with TEAM now, working on criminal justice reform. So you'll see these lawmakers have passionate issues during their service, and will continue pushing those later on. And so as you watch through the process with those bills, just understand that you're probably going to see those different ideas some similar, some identical go through, and you just have to do your legwork to make sure that you've got all your bases covered. Is it a good idea to invite legislators to speak or to school to speak with students about the legislative process? With school approval, of course. If so, how would you recommend going about that? The answer is emphatically yes. When I was on the House staff, we had a week called Legislator Back to School Week. It's a national program. Through that week, they encourage schools to invite lawmakers to come in and talk to the classes. I did that every year when I was a state representative, just because it's important to go visit with the students. I got interested in politics from paging for the state legislature. And so keep that in mind too. If you know of a high school student, a junior or senior who is interested in government, reach out to your senator or representative where they live and encourage them to be a page. Back to this direct question about schools, absolutely. The legislators should understand they shouldn't get in and try and push policy, essentially lobby for policy, because you can't do that on school grounds. But it's important for them to come in and talk about the process and talk about themselves, why they are the representative. Sometimes it happens in a campaign year. The lawmakers shouldn't campaign on school property. So just make sure they don't bring campaign materials with them. Some of the newer ones don't realize they can't do that. But just make sure you follow the laws so it won't get you in trouble with the school board or the superintendent or principal, but definitely invite lawmakers to come visit your classroom. You're going to see, and for those of you who don't know, attorneys are not the most represented profession at the legislature. It's retired educators. So you're going to see a lot of these educators who would love the opportunity to go back in the classroom, because you cannot draw two state salaries at once, and a teacher salary is considered a state salary. So teachers have to resign their positions to go serve in the legislature. George Nye famously is known, he was a school teacher, and he had to, or back then they could do that. They would meet every other year, and then he would go back to McAllister and be a teacher. Through the years that changed, where teachers couldn't serve in the legislature, and so they have to choose if they want to be a teacher or be a lawmaker. And we've got some fantastic teachers up there in the Capitol who have made great lawmakers.